Have you ever looked at someone you loved and wondered, when did everything change? Was it a slow unraveling, slipping through your fingers before you even realized it? Or was it sudden? One moment of truth that shattered everything you thought was real? Julia Weston never imagined she'd ask herself those questions. She believed in love, in marriage, in the quiet promises that built a life. For 15 years she had been a wife, a mother, a woman who held her family together through the highs and lows. She had trusted Mark, the man she thought would stand beside her forever. But forever doesn't always last. One evening, expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner and a glass of wine, Julia discovered the kind of truth that leaves you breathless. A hotel reservation, 2 guests, and a woman who wasn't her. In that moment, the life she had built collapsed around her. The memories, the laughter, the years they had shared, suddenly meaningless. What do you do when the person you built your future with becomes a stranger? Do you fight for something that's already broken? Or do you walk away, even when it feels like leaving a part of yourself behind? This is Julia's story. A journey of heartbreak, but also of healing. A story about betrayal, yes, but more importantly about what comes after. Because when everything you know is taken away, you're left with one question. Who am I now? Stay with me. As we unfold this tale, you'll see how Julia finds the answers. Answers that might surprise you, inspire you, or even remind you of your own story. Because heartbreak isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of something even more beautiful. So let me ask you, what would you have done? Stay, fight, or walk away? Let's find out together. Here is the rewritten story in English, crafted in a style similar to Nicholas Sparks, targeting middle-aged American readers. The late afternoon sun bathed the quiet town of Willow Creek in golden light, casting long shadows over the tree-lined streets. Julia Weston gripped the steering wheel of her SUV as she pulled into her driveway, a familiar sense of exhaustion settling into her bones. It had been another long shift at the clinic, another day spent caring for others while the weight of her own life pressed heavily on her chest. She was 38 years old, married to the same man for nearly 15 years, and a mother of 2. To the outside world, she had the perfect life. A loving husband, a beautiful home, and a family that anyone would envy. But perfection was an illusion, one she had worked tirelessly to maintain, even as the cracks beneath it grew wider. Her husband, Mark, had been distant for months. The small, everyday gestures of affection had slowly disappeared. The morning kisses that once lingered, the random text just to say, "I love you," the way he used to pull her into his arms for no reason at all. Lately, there had been excuses, late nights at the office, and the hollow smile he gave her whenever she asked if everything was okay. Julia had spent weeks convincing herself that she was imagining things. Tonight, she was ready to prove herself wrong. She had planned everything. The kids were at her mother's house for the weekend. She had set the dining table with Mark's favorite meal, and there was a bottle of the wine they had shared on their honeymoon chilling in the fridge. Tonight was about them. About remembering who they were before life had turned them into mere roommates. But when she stepped into the house, a chill of unease settled over her. The air smelled of nothing, no hint of the cologne Mark usually wore, no lingering scent of the dinner he had promised he'd pick up. She set down her purse and called his name, but only silence greeted her. That was when she noticed his car wasn't in the driveway. Julia let out a slow breath, pushing aside the sinking feeling in her stomach. Maybe he had gotten caught up at work again, lost track of time. She reached for her phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. The unease grew into something more, something sharper. Her hands moved on their own, opening his laptop on the kitchen counter, the one he rarely let her touch. The screen flickered to life, and it took only seconds to find what she hadn't even realized she had been searching for. An email, unread but open. A reservation confirmation. A hotel. 2 guests. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred, the words swimming before her eyes. The hotel was 30 miles away, a place she recognized from a brochure Mark had once brought home, talking about how he'd love to take her there someday. But he hadn't taken her. He had taken someone else. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in. Every doubt she had silenced, every fear she had buried, all of it came crashing down. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her keys, heart pounding so violently she thought it might shatter inside her chest. She didn't think. She just moved, slipping back into her SUV and heading toward the highway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The drive was a blur, a mixture of emotions she couldn't name, a pain so raw it burned. 15 years. A life built together. Had it all been a lie? When she pulled into the hotel parking lot, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, she told herself she could be wrong. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe. And then she saw him. Mark stood just outside the entrance, laughing at something, his hands on the arms of another woman. She was younger, blonde, the kind of effortlessly beautiful that made Julia's stomach twist. Her world tilted. It wasn't just that he was here with another woman. It was the way he looked at her, the way he had once looked at Julia, like she was the center of his universe. Mark hadn't looked at Julia that way in years. The betrayal was a physical thing, a punch to the gut that stole the air from her lungs. Her hands shook, her mind screaming at her to leave, to turn around before he saw her, before this became even more real. But she couldn't move. Not as Mark leaned down, pressing a slow, lingering kiss to the woman's lips. Not as the woman curled into him like she belonged there. Not as Julia's heart broke in two. The pain was sharp, overwhelming, but beneath it was something colder. Something that had been waiting, buried deep inside her, for this exact moment. She had spent 15 years building a life with this man, and now she was going to take it back. Here is the continuation of the story in the style of Nicholas Sparks, maintaining American cultural references and targeting middle-aged readers. Julia didn't remember getting out of the car. One moment, she was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and the next she was standing on the sidewalk, her body moving on autopilot. The cool evening air did nothing to calm the fire raging inside her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply watched. Mark's hand slid down the woman's arm, his touch slow, intimate, familiar. Julia had memorized that touch, the way his fingers had once traced lazy circles along her skin when they lay in bed at night, the way he had pulled her close when she was cold, his lips brushing against her forehead like she was the most precious thing in the world. But now that touch belonged to someone else. Her stomach clenched as the woman laughed, tilting her head up so Mark could kiss her again. It was effortless, practiced, as if they had done this 100 times before. Julia felt like she was drowning. A part of her wanted to walk away, to turn back to her car and drive until she forgot this moment had ever existed. But another part, the one that had been ignored for far too long, refused to back down. She stepped forward. Mark. His name left her lips like a whisper, but it cut through the air like a gunshot. Mark turned, his expression shifting in a second, from happiness to confusion, then to something else entirely. Guilt. He took a step back, like the sight of her physically knocked the breath out of him. Julia. The woman beside him stiffened, glancing between them, realization dawning in her wide blue eyes. Julia had seen enough. You lied to me, she said, her voice barely more than a breath but steady, strong. All those nights. All those excuses. Her heart pounded, but her hands were still. How long? Mark ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit she had once found endearing. Now it made her sick. Julia, let's talk about this somewhere else. How long? She repeated, firmer this time. Mark sighed, glancing at the woman before turning his gaze back to Julia. 6 months. The answer landed like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. 6 months. While she had been holding their marriage together with both hands, convincing herself that they were just going through a rough patch, he had been here. With her. Julia nodded, the pieces clicking into place. The late nights. The forgotten anniversaries. The distance that had grown between them like an unseen canyon. One she had tried to cross alone. You should go, Mark said quietly, his voice softer now, like he was doing her a favor. This isn't the place. Julia let out a breathless laugh. You're right. This isn't the place. But neither was our bed. Our home. Our life. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Julia had already turned away. She didn't remember getting back into her car. She only remembered driving, the hotel lights disappearing behind her, the road stretching endlessly in front of her. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside her. 15 years. 15 years, and this was how it ended. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to stop. She kept driving past their neighborhood, past familiar streets filled with memories she no longer wanted. She didn't stop until she reached the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore, the scent of salt and rain heavy in the air. Julia stepped out of the car, the sand cool beneath her bare feet as she walked toward the water. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the horizon, at the endless stretch of black sky meeting the restless sea. She had spent her whole life building something with Mark, only to watch it crumble in an instant. And now she was left standing in the ruins. Her body ached. Her heart shattered into pieces she wasn't sure she could ever put back together. She had loved him. She had trusted him. And he had destroyed everything. The wind howled around her, pushing against her like it was daring her to break. But she didn't break. Not yet. Instead, she turned and walked back to her car. She had no idea where she was going. No idea what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she knew one thing for certain. She would never be that woman again. The one who waited. The one who begged for love from a man who had already given it away. No, Julia Weston had been shattered. But she would find a way to rebuild. Even if she had to do it alone. Here is the next section of the story in the style of Nicholas Sparks, focusing on the aftermath and transformation of Julia Weston, the betrayed wife. This section maintains an emotional depth that resonates with middle-aged American readers, ensuring a culturally accurate and immersive experience. Julia Weston had never felt so empty. The days that followed blurred into one another, a monotonous cycle of exhaustion and silence. She moved through life on autopilot, getting up, going to work, making sure the kids had what they needed. But inside she was hollow. The woman she had been, the wife, the partner, the believer in second chances, was gone. It wasn't just Mark's betrayal that had broken her. It was the realization that she had spent years lying to herself, ignoring the growing distance, convincing herself that love could be sustained by memories alone. She had given him everything, and he had given it to someone else. Her mother had come to stay for a few days, helping with the kids, filling the house with the warmth that Julia could no longer summon. "You have to eat, sweetheart," her mother had said gently one morning, pushing a plate of toast in front of her. Julia had only stared at it. Food had lost its taste. Sleep was fleeting. Even the simplest conversations felt exhausting. But worst of all, she couldn't cry. The tears had come that night by the ocean, but now they refused to fall. She wished they would. She wished she could scream, break something, let the anger out. But all she could do was exist. She didn't respond to Mark's messages. At first, they were apologetic, filled with empty words about how he never meant to hurt her. Then they turned defensive, accusing her of giving up too easily, of refusing to hear his side of the story. She had deleted them all. The divorce papers came 2 weeks later. She stared at them for hours, the words blurring on the page. She had expected them, of course. Mark had always been a man of action, eager to move forward, to erase the past when it no longer served him. But Julia wasn't ready. Not because she still loved him, but because she no longer knew who she was without him. For 15 years she had been Julia Weston, the wife, the mother, the woman who believed in family, in partnership, in the idea that love could endure anything. And now she was just Julia. The reality of it settled into her bones, heavier than she had expected. She needed to get away. Not forever. Not even for long. Just long enough to breathe. She packed a bag that night, tossing in jeans, sweaters, a pair of worn sneakers. She left a note for her mother, kissed her children's foreheads as they slept, and drove without looking back. She didn't know where she was going until she got there. Charleston. It was where she and Mark had honeymooned all those years ago, where she had once walked cobblestone streets in bare feet, laughing as he carried her sandals in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in the other. That memory hurt now, but she refused to let it own her. This wasn't about the past. This was about her. She checked into a small inn by the waterfront, the kind of place she had always wanted to visit but never had the time for. The owner, an older woman with kind eyes, handed her the key with a knowing smile. "Heartbreak or soul-searching?" she asked. Julia hesitated, then answered honestly, "Both." The woman nodded, as if she understood. "Then you came to the right place." And maybe she had. For the first time in weeks, Julia slept through the night. In the mornings, she walked along the harbor, watching the boats drift lazily in and out of the docks. She drank her coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, the quiet. In the afternoons, she wandered the historic district, letting herself get lost in the charm of it all. The pastel houses, the smell of salt in the air, the way the world kept moving, even when hers had stopped. She didn't think about Mark. She thought about herself, what she wanted, who she wanted to be. One afternoon, she found herself in a small bookshop, running her fingers along the spines of novels she had once loved but never had time to read. Looking for something in particular? The voice was deep, warm, the kind that made you turn around before you even realized you were responding. She did. He was standing near the window, a book in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other. Late 40s maybe. Tall, with dark hair that was beginning to gray at the temples. He had the kind of presence that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. She hadn't spoken to a man in weeks, not in any way that mattered. But she smiled just a little. "Just something to remind me who I used to be," she said. He nodded, setting his book down. "Then you need poetry." She raised an eyebrow. "Poetry?" He picked up a worn copy of Mary Oliver's work and handed it to her. "She has a way of making you believe in yourself again." Julia took the book, running her fingers along the cover. It had been years since she had read poetry. Longer still since she had let herself feel the kind of things it evoked. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. The man nodded, offering a small smile before returning to his own book. Julia lingered a moment longer before heading to the counter, purchasing the poetry collection without a second thought. That night, she sat by her window, the book open on her lap, the words wrapping around her like a balm to her soul. She read, and for the first time since that night outside the hotel, she cried. Not for Mark. Not for what she had lost. But for herself. For the woman who had been waiting, quietly, patiently, to be seen again. And as the city lights flickered below, Julia Weston, no, just Julia, realized something. She wasn't lost. She was finding her way home. Here is the continuation of the story, following Julia's healing journey and transformation. This section maintains the emotional depth and storytelling style of Nicholas Sparks, while ensuring cultural accuracy for an American audience. The days in Charleston stretched into weeks, and Julia found herself settling into a new rhythm, one that belonged only to her. The early mornings were hers, spent walking along the harbor with the scent of salt in the air and the cool breeze against her skin. The afternoons were quiet, filled with books and long, unhurried conversations with strangers in coffee shops. And the nights, those were the hardest, but they were changing too. She was learning to be alone. At first it had felt unnatural. For 15 years her life had been intertwined with someone else's. Her schedule, her choices, her very sense of self shaped by marriage and motherhood. But now there was an odd sort of peace in the stillness, in knowing that no one was waiting for her to cook dinner, to fold their laundry, to ask how their day had been. She had spent so long giving that she had forgotten what it was like to receive, to wake up and think only of what she wanted, of what made her happy. And slowly she was figuring that out. One evening, she found herself back at the small bookshop where she had met the man with the graying hair and the quiet voice. She didn't expect to see him again. But there he was, leaning against the counter, flipping through a hardcover novel. "Mary Oliver," he said when he saw her, setting the book down with a knowing smile. "Did it help?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "More than I expected." "Good," he said. "You looked like you needed it." She should have been offended. A month ago she might have been. But now she only nodded. "I did." The man studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "I don't believe I introduced myself last time. I'm Daniel." She hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. "Julia." It was strange saying her name like that. No last name, no title attached to it. Just Julia. Over the next few weeks, she ran into him more often, sometimes at the bookshop, sometimes at the little cafe on the corner where she had started spending her afternoons. They never planned to meet, but somehow they always seemed to be in the same place at the same time. She learned that he was a professor at a nearby university, that he had been married once too, that loss had shaped him in ways he rarely spoke about. He never pried into her past, never asked about the empty space on her ring finger. And maybe that's why she found herself talking to him anyway. About the life she had left behind, the pain she still carried, the fear of what came next. "You're not broken, you know," he told her one evening as they walked along the water. "You're just unfinished." She looked at him, the weight of his words settling into her chest. "I feel broken," she admitted. Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "Then you're underestimating yourself." It had been a long time since anyone had believed in her like that. Longer still since she had believed in herself. One evening as she sat in her room, staring out at the city lights flickering across the water, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Mark. She hadn't spoken to him since she left. His messages had stopped weeks ago, and she had assumed he had finally moved on, that he had given up whatever guilt had lingered. But now his name was there again, glowing on the screen like a ghost. For the first time, she didn't feel the familiar sting of pain when she saw it. She hesitated, then picked up the phone, letting out a slow breath before pressing the button. "Hello." There was silence on the other end, then a quiet sigh. "Julia." She waited. He paused. "I heard you left town. I wasn't sure if you'd even pick up. Why are you calling, Mark?" He hesitated again, and for a brief moment she wondered if he even knew. "I don't know," he admitted. I just wanted to hear your voice." Julia closed her eyes, gripping the phone a little tighter. A month ago, those words would have shattered her. Now they only felt like echoes of something that no longer belonged to her. She didn't want to be cruel, but she also didn't want to give him the illusion that things could ever be the same. "I'm doing okay," she said finally. "And I think you should let me." Mark was quiet for a long time before he spoke again. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time she believed him. "I know," she said, "but it doesn't change anything." And it didn't. She ended the call, setting the phone down on the table beside her. For the first time since it all fell apart, she felt light. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because she had finally let go of the weight she had been carrying. She stood up, walking over to the window, staring out at the city she had begun to love in a way she never expected. She wasn't healed yet. Not completely. But she was getting there. And for now that was enough. Here is the final part of the story, written in the style of Nicholas Sparks, ensuring cultural accuracy for an American audience while maintaining emotional depth and an open-ended resolution. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Julia's small room, casting soft golden light across the wooden floor. She stretched beneath the cotton sheets, the air still carrying the distant scent of salt and jasmine from the garden below. It had been almost 2 months since she had arrived in Charleston, and something in her had shifted, slowly, quietly, like the tide receding after a long storm. For the first time in years she felt free. Not entirely healed, not without scars, but no longer shackled by the past. The weight of Mark's betrayal no longer sat on her chest like an unbearable burden. The pain was still there, but it had softened, becoming something she could live with rather than something that consumed her. She slipped out of bed and padded to the window, resting her palms against the cool glass. The city below was just waking up. Shop owners unlocking their doors, tourists wandering toward the cafes, a violinist playing something soft and mournful on the corner. She had fallen in love with this place. Not in the way she once had with Mark or the way she might one day love again, but in a way that felt personal. Charleston had become a part of her healing, the backdrop of her transformation. The old her, Julia Weston, the wife, the woman who had built her world around a marriage that no longer existed, had slowly faded, and in her place stood someone new. Someone she was still getting to know. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at it, expecting another message from Mark that she would ignore, but instead it was from Daniel. "Coffee? The usual spot?" She smiled, typing a quick response before grabbing her sweater. Daniel had become an unexpected presence in her life. He was steady, thoughtful, never asking for more than she was ready to give. They met often, sometimes at the bookshop, sometimes at the waterfront, sometimes in the quiet of the city's hidden gardens where Spanish moss draped like lace over iron gates. He never pushed, never pressed for details about her past. And maybe that's why she trusted him. When she arrived at the cafe, Daniel was already there, a newspaper folded on the table beside his coffee. He looked up when she approached, offering that familiar, easy smile. "Good morning," he said, sliding her cup across the table. "Morning," she replied, wrapping her hands around the warmth of the ceramic mug. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the city move around them. Finally, Daniel set his coffee down and studied her. "You look different today." Julia arched a brow. "Different how?" He considered this, then shrugged. "Lighter. Like you've made a decision." She smiled softly because maybe she had. "I think I have," she admitted. "I think it's time for me to go home." Daniel nodded, as if he had expected this. "Have you told anyone?" "No. Not yet." She hesitated, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger. "I needed to be sure first." "And now you are?" She met his gaze, steady and sure. "Yes. It was time." She missed her children more than she had words for. And while her mother had reassured her time and time again that they were doing fine, Julia knew she needed to be there for them. They needed to see her not as the woman who had left, but as the woman who had returned stronger. She wasn't going back for Mark. That part of her life was over. But she was going back for herself. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching her with something unreadable in his expression. "And what about here?" Julia exhaled slowly. "This place will always mean something to me. It's where I learned to breathe again." Daniel nodded, but she saw the flicker of something else in his eyes. Something almost hesitant. "I never asked," he said after a moment. "But is there a chance you might come back?" She studied him then, this man who had been nothing but patient, who had met her exactly where she was without ever asking for more. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'd like to." His lips twitched into a half-smile. "Then I'll take that." And for now that was enough. The drive home felt different than the one that had brought her here. When she had left, she had been running. Fleeing from pain, from betrayal, from the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. But now, as she crossed state lines, as the familiar roads of home came into view, she wasn't running anymore. She was ready. Her mother was the first to greet her, pulling her into a long wordless hug before stepping back to study her with misty eyes. "You look good," she said finally. "I feel good," Julia replied, and for the first time it was the truth. Her children clung to her, peppering her with questions about where she had been, what she had seen, whether she had brought them anything. And she had small trinkets, books, a seashell from the beach where she had spent countless hours rediscovering herself. They didn't ask about Mark, and she didn't bring him up. But later that night, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, there was a knock at the door. Julia knew who it was before she even opened it. Mark stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes shadowed with something unreadable. "Hi," he said softly. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "Hi." There was a silence between them, thick with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. "I heard you were back," he said finally. "I am." He nodded, looking down at his feet. I don't know what I expected, but you look different." She smiled faintly, tilting her head. "I am different." Mark exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Julia, I don't need an apology," she interrupted gently. "Not anymore." He looked at her then, something like regret flickering across his face. "I just want you to know. I never wanted to hurt you." She let out a soft breath, nodding. "I know. And maybe once that would have mattered. But not anymore." She looked at him one last time, really looked at him and realized something. She didn't love him anymore. Not in the way she once had. Not in the way that would ever make her stay. "Take care of yourself, Mark," she said, her voice steady. She didn't wait for his response. She simply turned, stepping back inside, closing the door softly behind her. And just like that, she let go. A month later, she received a letter in the mail. No return address, but she knew who it was from before she even opened it. "Julia, I don't know if you'll ever come back to Charleston, but if you do, there will always be coffee waiting for you. And maybe something more if you ever want it. Take your time. Live your life. But just know some people are worth coming back for. Daniel." Julia smiled, tracing the words with her fingertips. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Life has a way of teaching us that every choice we make has consequences. Julia's story is a reminder that while betrayal and heartbreak can shake the very foundation of our lives, the way we respond to pain ultimately defines our future. Mark made a choice, a selfish one, That led to the destruction of his marriage. But Julia also made a choice. She chose to walk away with dignity, to heal instead of seeking revenge, and to rediscover her own worth. This is the essence of karma. What we put into the world comes back to us in ways we often don't expect. Mark lost a loyal and loving wife because of his actions, while Julia, despite the pain she endured, found peace, self-love, and the possibility of new beginnings. This is proof that good people, even when hurt, will find happiness again if they choose to stay true to their values. Kindness, morality, and resilience are never wasted. Julia didn't let betrayal turn her into someone bitter or vengeful. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life with integrity, and because of that, new doors opened for her. Doors she never imagined. This is why doing the right thing, even when it's hard, will always lead to something better. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that changed the course of your life? How did you choose to handle it? Do you believe that good people will always find happiness in the end? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who is going through a similar journey.